The entire 40th floor of Albright Global had never felt this quiet. 12 interpreters, each one hand-picked, certified, and expensive, had tried and failed. Mr. Takeshi Yamamoto, chairman of Japan's largest industrial conglomerate, was already reaching for his briefcase. A $2.3 billion partnership was dying in real time. Claire Ashford stood frozen, watching her career collapse in slow motion. CEO Richard Albright gripped the edge of the mahogany table, knuckles white, and then the conference room door opened. A man in a faded cleaning uniform, still holding a bottle of glass cleaner, stepped inside and spoke in flawless Kyoto dialect Japanese. Every head in the room turned. No one was breathing. 6 hours earlier, the city was still asleep. Ethan Mercer opened his eyes at 4:30 in the morning to the sound of his daughter coughing in the dark. It was a dry, hollow sound, the kind that rattled deep in her small chest and never quite went away. He lay still for a moment, listening, counting the seconds between each cough the way he had learned to do over the past year. When the intervals stayed steady, he exhaled slowly and swung his legs off the narrow mattress. Their apartment in Queens was barely 500 square feet. A studio with a curtain dividing the sleeping area from the kitchen, where a single window faced a brick wall across the alley. The rent was $1,400 a month, which took nearly everything he earned. But it was close to his mother-in-law's place, 4 blocks east, and that mattered more than square footage or sunlight. Ethan moved quietly through the dim room, stepping over Lily's shoes by the door, and began making breakfast. 2 scrambled eggs, 1 slice of toast, a glass of milk. He set the plate on the small table and went to wake her. Lily Mercer was 6 years old, with her mother's pale blue eyes and a laugh that could fill a room twice this size. But lately, that laugh came less often. She tired easily. Stares left her breathless. Her pediatric cardiologist had used words that no father should have to memorize. Words like congenital defect, deteriorating valve function, and surgical intervention required within the year. The estimated cost of the operation was $120,000, and their insurance would cover only a fraction. Ethan had done the math so many times the numbers lived behind his eyelids. He had sold everything that could be sold. He had taken extra shifts whenever they were offered. He was still nowhere close. He braided her hair that morning the way he always did, carefully, methodically, a skill he had taught himself by watching tutorials on his phone late at night after she fell asleep. His fingers were thick from years of manual labor, but they moved through her fine blonde hair with practiced tenderness. The braid was never perfect, but Lily always touched it with both hands and said it was beautiful, and that was enough. He walked her to his mother-in-law's apartment 4 blocks away, kissed her forehead, and told her he would pick her up at 3. She waved from the window as he disappeared down the stairs, and he waved back without looking, because he always knew exactly when she would be watching. Then he descended into the subway and rode the train into Manhattan, a worn German novel open on his lap. The pages were soft from years of handling, the spine cracked in 3 places, the margins filled with pencil notes in his own handwriting. He read a few paragraphs, mouthing the words silently, the way he always did, no matter how exhausted he was. Language had always been his companion, his private cathedral. Even now, even in this life that had shrunk to the size of a studio apartment and a cleaning cart, he refused to let it go. Ethan's shift at Albright Global started on the 38th floor and worked upward to the 42nd, the executive level. He pushed his cleaning cart through corridors of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, emptying wastebaskets, wiping conference tables, vacuuming carpets that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that invisibility was a form of survival. Employees passed him without acknowledgement. A mid-level manager nearly collided with his cart in the hallway, glanced down at the uniform, and walked away without a word or a nod. To the people in this building, Ethan Mercer did not exist. He was furniture with a heartbeat. He had made peace with that invisibility a long time ago. Pride was a luxury, and luxuries did not pay for heart surgery. He was polishing the glass partition outside conference room 41A when Claire Ashford appeared. She came around the corner fast, phone pressed to her ear, 3 assistants trailing behind her like satellites caught in a gravity field. Her voice was sharp, clipped, the voice of someone running out of time and patience simultaneously. She turned the corner and her hip caught the edge of Ethan's cart. A stack of documents slid off the top and scattered across the polished floor in a fan of white paper. Claire did not stop. She did not apologize. She barely glanced back, already disappearing through the conference room doors, her voice continuing without interruption into the phone. Ethan knelt and began gathering the papers. They were printed on heavy stock, the kind used for formal negotiations, and as he stacked them, his eyes caught something that made his hands go still. The documents were in Japanese. More specifically, they contained the dual-language negotiation framework for today's meeting with the Yamamoto Group, side-by-side English and Japanese columns outlining terms and conditions for the proposed partnership. Ethan scanned the pages methodically, the way a musician might scan sheet music, reading not just the notes but the spaces between them. When he reached Clause 7, a cold recognition settled in his chest. The English translation read exclusive, implying sole rights and binding restriction. But the original Japanese text used a term that meant preferential, suggesting priority access but not exclusivity. In the context of mergers and acquisitions law, the difference between those two words could shift legal obligations by hundreds of millions of dollars and fundamentally alter the balance of the entire partnership. Ethan stared at the page. Every instinct in his body told him this mattered, that someone needed to know before this meeting began. But then he looked down at his faded uniform, at the cleaning supplies on his cart, at his own reflection in the polished marble beneath his knees, a janitor holding documents he was never meant to read. He straightened the stack carefully, placed it back on the cart, and went back to wiping the glass. Some doors, he had learned, were not meant for people like him. 30 minutes before the scheduled negotiation, the conference room on the 40th floor buzzed with controlled tension. Claire Ashford stood at the head of the table running through final preparations with her team. 4 professional interpreters sat along one side of the table, their credentials impeccable, each one specializing in Japanese corporate communication. 2 additional interpreters were standing by on video link from Washington and Tokyo, ready as backup. On paper, every contingency was covered. The preparation had taken weeks. The stakes justified the expense. But Claire's confidence was a performance, and she knew it. Inside, she was holding herself together with wire and willpower. This deal was her career distilled into a single afternoon. The partnership with the Yamamoto Group would position Albright Global as the dominant force in Pacific Rim industrial technology for the next decade. If it succeeded, Claire would cement her place as one of the most powerful executives in the company. If it failed, Derek Holton would bury her, and he would enjoy every minute of it. Derek sat in the corner of the room with his arms folded, watching the preparations with the patient satisfaction of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and liked most of them. As chief financial officer, he had the ear of the board and ambition that ran deeper than his title suggested. He had wanted Claire's position for years, and a public failure of this magnitude would hand him exactly the leverage he needed. Claire could feel his eyes on her like a low-grade fever that never broke. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She knew exactly what he was thinking. The Japanese delegation arrived precisely on schedule. Black sedans lined the street below. Security personnel stood at every entrance. Mr. Takeshi Yamamoto entered the conference room with the quiet gravity of a man who had built an empire and saw no need to announce it. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, with sharp eyes that moved slowly across the room and missed nothing. He bowed slightly, shook hands with Richard Albright, exchanged a few words of courtesy, and took his seat at the head of the delegate's side. Then he spoke his first words of substance, a formal greeting in the classical Kyoto dialect of Japanese, layered with honorific structures that reflected centuries of cultural tradition, the language of merchant families who had traded in trust long before contracts existed. The first interpreter responded in standard Tokyo Japanese. Yamamoto's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around his eyes, a subtle withdrawal of warmth, the way a door closes not with a slam but with a quiet click. He did not correct the interpreter. He simply continued, his words now slightly more guarded, his sentences shorter, his meaning more carefully concealed behind layers of polite indirection. Outside the conference room, Ethan was cleaning the glass wall of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could hear the exchange with perfect clarity. He recognized the problem immediately. The interpreters were speaking modern standard Japanese, the language of textbooks and business schools and international certification exams. But Yamamoto was speaking Kansai dialect, the language of Kyoto's old merchant families, rich with classical honorific forms and subtle verbal hierarchies that no language program in America taught. The interpreter was translating his words accurately but missing his meaning entirely, like someone reading the notes of a symphony without hearing the music. Claire stepped into the hallway to retrieve a supplementary binder from her assistant's station. She noticed Ethan standing near the glass wall, his cloth motionless in his hand, his head slightly tilted toward the open door. Her eyes narrowed with mild irritation. She was not in the mood for idle spectators. "Do you need something?" Her voice was brisk, already turning away, already done with him. Ethan stepped back and shook his head. But before he turned to leave, something stopped him. A quiet refusal, buried deep in his chest, to walk away from what he knew was wrong. He spoke in a low, even voice, the voice of a man who was not trying to impress anyone but could not stay silent. The translation in Clause 7 has an error. The English version says exclusive, but the original Japanese says preferential. In an M&A context, those two terms create entirely different legal obligations. The way it reads now, your side is promising something the Japanese side never asked for. Claire froze. She looked at him, then down at the binder in her hands, then back at him. For the first time since she had walked into this building that morning, for perhaps the first time in the 3 years Ethan had worked on this floor, she actually saw the man standing in front of her. Not a janitor, not a uniform, not part of the background. A person who had just identified a critical legal discrepancy that her entire team of translators, lawyers, and consultants had missed. Inside the conference room, the negotiation was unraveling in slow motion. The first interpreter's misstep with honorifics had set an undertone of subtle disrespect that Yamamoto registered in his posture and his pauses, even if he never addressed it directly. The second interpreter possessed stronger grammar but mistranslated key financial terminology specific to cross-border mergers, turning a conditional proposal into what sounded like an ultimatum. The third interpreter's pronunciation carried a regional accent that the Japanese delegation found distracting, pulling their attention away from the substance and toward the delivery. One by one, 6 on-site interpreters rotated through the chair beside Claire, and one by one, they failed to bridge the widening gap between the two sides of the table. Claire called in the 4 backup interpreters via video link. The first suffered from audio delay that made real-time conversation impossible, each response arriving half a second too late, fracturing the rhythm of dialogue that Japanese business culture considers sacred. The second and third were competent linguists who had handled diplomatic functions and academic conferences, but had no experience with the specialized vocabulary of international corporate acquisitions, the language of due diligence, equity swaps, and cross-border indemnification. The fourth managed to sustain a coherent discussion for nearly 10 minutes before Yamamoto leaned back slowly in his chair, removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and said in slow, deliberate English that landed like stones dropped into still water, "You don't understand what I mean." Not the words, the meaning. The 11th and 12th interpreters were summoned urgently from external agencies. one from a diplomatic language service with State Department contracts, the other from an embassy liaison office with decades of experience. Neither fared better. The problem had never been vocabulary or grammar or certification. It was culture. It was nuance. It was the vast invisible distance between translating a sentence and understanding the human being behind it. 12 interpreters had failed. The Japanese delegation began organizing their documents into neat stacks, aligning edges with the precision of people preparing to leave. Yamamoto rose slowly from his chair, straightened his jacket, and offered a polite bow to the room, a gesture that in Japanese custom signals not farewell but finality, the formal closing of a door that will not open again. Derek Holton leaned back in his chair with his face carefully neutral, but his eyes alive with quiet triumph. Richard Albright sat motionless at the head of the table, his fists clenched beneath the mahogany, his expression carved from stone. Claire stepped into the hallway. Her breathing was unsteady. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel, and there was Ethan, standing exactly where she had left him, the bottle of glass cleaner still in his hand, his eyes meeting hers directly. It was not the look of a curious bystander watching a building burn. It was the look of a man who knew he could stop the fire and was calculating whether stepping forward would cost him the only life he had left. "I know this isn't my place," he said, his voice low and steady and entirely without pretension. "But I speak Japanese, Kansai dialect, and I think I understand what Mr. Yamamoto has been trying to say all day." Claire knew this was insane. She knew that bringing a janitor into a $2.3 billion negotiation was the kind of decision that would either become a legend or a cautionary tale, with nothing in between. She looked through the glass wall at Yamamoto, who was fastening the buttons of his overcoat with the slow deliberation of a man who had already made up his mind. She had no interpreters left, no backup plans, no contingencies, only a man in a faded uniform who claimed he could do what 12 credentialed professionals could not. She pulled him into a small side room and closed the door. "You're serious? You speak Kansai dialect Japanese?" Ethan nodded once. Claire pressed further, urgency sharpening every syllable. "What else? What other languages?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment, as if the answer itself embarrassed him. Then he said, quietly, "French, German, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. 8 languages." Claire stared at him. 8 languages from a man who mopped floors for a living. The question escaped her before she could weigh whether it was appropriate. "Why are you here? Why are you doing this job?" Ethan looked down at his work shoes, the rubber soles worn smooth from years of walking marble corridors that did not belong to him. His answer was simple and carried no self-pity. "Because the night shift lets me pick up my daughter at 3 in the afternoon, and she needs me close more than she needs me successful." Claire brought him into the conference room. Every head turned. The sight of a man in a cleaning uniform entering a boardroom full of executives, investors, and international delegates registered as something between bewilderment and insult. Derek was on his feet before the door closed behind them. "You cannot be serious, Claire. This is a janitor. You are going to let a janitor speak on behalf of this company in a negotiation worth $2.3 billion? His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who believed he had already won and resented being made to watch the losing side embarrass itself further. Richard Albright said nothing. He sat perfectly still, watching, his face revealing nothing, giving Claire neither permission nor denial. Yamamoto, who had already risen and begun reaching for his briefcase, paused. He looked at Ethan, and something in his expression shifted. Not trust. Not yet, but curiosity. The old chairman lowered himself slowly back into his chair. Ethan stepped to the center of the room and bowed. Not the casual, perfunctory nod that Westerners often mistake for Japanese etiquette, but a proper, deliberate bow. His back straight, the angle precise to 30 degrees, the exact form used to express deep and sincere respect to a senior figure in Japanese culture. Then he spoke in Kansai dialect, his voice measured and reverent, unhurried, each syllable carrying the weight and care of someone who understood that in Japanese tradition, how something is said matters as much as what is said. The words he chose were not from any textbook. They were the words of someone who had listened, who had lived inside the language, who had learned it not as a skill but as a relationship. Yamamoto's eyes widened. His hand, which had been resting on his briefcase, moved slowly to the table. For the first time in the entire negotiation, the chairman of Japan's most powerful industrial conglomerate smiled. Ethan began to translate, and the atmosphere in the conference room did not simply shift, it transformed. He did not convert words from one language to another the way a machine processes input and generates output. He translated context. He translated respect. He translated the invisible architecture of cultural meaning that exists beneath every sentence, the part that dictionaries cannot capture and certifications cannot measure. When Claire presented the company's long-term vision for the partnership, Ethan rendered it in Japanese using honorific structures and phrasing patterns that only someone who had truly lived within Kansai culture would know, not the formal Japanese taught in classrooms, but the living language absorbed through real conversations, real meals, real silences shared with real people. Yamamoto began to open. His sentences grew longer. His tone shifted from the guarded formality of a man protecting himself from disappointment to the measured candor of someone who felt genuinely heard for the first time all day. He shared concerns he had not voiced during any of the previous sessions. It became clear that his resistance to the deal had never been about financial terms, equity percentages, or contractual language. It was about sincerity. Yamamoto wanted to know that the people on the other side of the table understood his family's philosophy of doing business, a philosophy built over 3 generations, and rooted in the belief that a true partnership means shared values, shared sacrifice, and shared accountability, not merely shared profits. Then came the moment that shifted everything irreversibly. Yamamoto turned to Ethan, and in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of a formal inquiry, he asked in Japanese, "You are not a businessman. You are not one of them. So tell me, who are you?" Ethan answered honestly. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He explained briefly that he had once worked as a humanitarian interpreter in 6 countries: Haiti after the earthquake, Syria during the refugee crisis, the Congo during a cholera epidemic, that his wife had passed away 3 years ago in a car accident, that he now cleaned office buildings at night to support a 6-year-old daughter with a congenital heart defect who needed surgery he could not afford. He spoke in the same tone a man might use to describe the route he takes to work. Factual, unhurried, without appeal for sympathy. Yamamoto was silent for a very long time. The room waited. Then the old chairman nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that held more gravity than any signature on any contract. It was not a nod of politeness. It was recognition, one human being acknowledging the substance of another. Claire watched the entire exchange from across the table. She did not understand a word of Japanese, but she understood the language of the body. Yamamoto was leaning forward now, his palms resting open on the table, his shoulders released from the tension he had carried all day. In Japanese culture, open palms on the table signal vulnerability, trust, and a willingness to be seen. For the first time since the delegation had walked into this building, both sides were truly communicating, not performing. Derek cut in from the corner, his voice slicing across the room like a blade. He suggested to Richard that this experiment had gone far enough and recommended they bring in a qualified interpreter from an outside agency before the situation deteriorated further. Richard Albright did not turn around. He simply raised one hand, palm flat, and spoke 2 words that silenced the room. "Sit down, Derek." During the break between negotiation sessions, the 40th floor fell quiet. Most of the delegates retreated to a private lounge down the hall, and the corridor outside the conference room was empty except for the hum of the air system and the distant sound of an elevator arriving and departing. Claire found Ethan at the far end of the hallway, leaning against the wall near the service elevator, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, tender, stripped of every layer of composure he had worn inside that boardroom. "Did she take her medicine this morning? Please don't let Lily run around too much, Mom. You know how she gets. I'll be home early today, I promise." Claire stopped walking. She had not intended to listen, but something in the gentleness of his voice held her where she stood, the way a piece of music can stop you mid-step, not because it is loud, but because it is true. When he ended the call, she was still there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then they began to talk, and for the first time, the conversation had nothing to do with interpreters, contracts, or billion-dollar negotiations. They talked as two people standing on the 40th floor of a building that neither of them had been born to belong in. Claire asked about the 8 languages. Ethan told her. His father had been a plumber who worked 60-hour weeks and never complained. His mother had worked as a kitchen assistant at a restaurant downtown, coming home each night smelling of cooking oil and industrial soap. No one in his family spoke anything but English. But the neighborhood where he grew up was a dense mosaic of immigrant families from every corner of the world. He learned Spanish from his grandmother, who had crossed the border decades ago and never stopped singing in her mother tongue, French from an elderly retired literature professor who lived in the apartment next door and needed someone to talk to, Mandarin from the owner of a tiny grocery store where Ethan stocked shelves after school in exchange for food his family could not always afford, Arabic from long nights spent listening to international radio broadcasts when sleep refused to come, Portuguese from co-workers on construction sites during summer jobs that left his hands blistered and his vocabulary expanded, German from borrowed cassette tapes at the public library, rewound and replayed until the ribbons stretched thin, and Japanese from a college exchange student who had arrived in the neighborhood without knowing a single person and needed a friend more than a tutor. "Languages are not talent," Ethan said quietly, looking at the floor rather than at her. "They're patience. And loneliness, looking for somewhere to go." Claire was silent for a long moment. Then she shared something she almost never told anyone. She had grown up in a trailer park in rural West Virginia, the daughter of a truck driver and a woman who cleaned houses. She was the first person in her family to graduate from high school, let alone attend college. During her very first job interview in New York City, the hiring manager had smiled politely and asked where her accent was from, the Appalachian cadence she had spent years trying to smooth away like a scar she was ashamed of. She understood what it felt like to walk into a room and know that people had already decided what you were worth before you opened your mouth. But she had chosen to fight by climbing, by outworking and outperforming everyone around her until they could no longer afford to look down. Ethan had chosen a different path. He had stopped climbing entirely and stayed where his daughter needed him to be. A brief silence settled between them, comfortable and unforced, the kind that only exists between two people who recognize in each other something they thought they were alone in carrying. Claire spoke softly. "You deserve more than this job." Ethan looked up and smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not self-pitying. It was simply honest. "Every job deserves respect," he said. "It's only the way people look at it that doesn't." The afternoon session resumed with an energy the morning had never possessed. Yamamoto was fully engaged now, discussing specific contractual terms and operational details with a level of precision that signaled genuine intent to move forward. Ethan translated with the same quiet grace, and Claire allowed herself, cautiously, for the first time in hours, to believe that this deal might actually survive. And then Derek struck. During the midday break, he had instructed his assistant to run a comprehensive background check on Ethan Mercer, and the results had arrived in his inbox 20 minutes ago. He had been waiting for the moment of maximum impact, and he chose it with surgical precision, standing just as Yamamoto was reviewing a key partnership clause. Derek rose from his chair, his voice carrying the polished concern of a man pretending to act in the company's best interest. "I think everyone at this table deserves to know something important before we go any further." He turned his laptop toward the center of the table and projected a scanned document onto the wall screen, an internal personnel memo from an international humanitarian relief organization. "The man who is currently serving as our interpreter in a $2.3 billion negotiation is a janitor. And not just any janitor. He was terminated from his previous career for violating financial protocols, specifically unauthorized diversion of organizational funds." Derek paused, letting the words settle into the room like smoke. "I believe in due diligence, and I believe this room deserves transparency." The room shifted. Murmurs rippled through the American side of the table. The Japanese delegates exchanged rapid, low-voiced comments among themselves. Claire turned to Ethan. He did not defend himself. He did not argue, protest, or explain. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his hands resting on his thighs, his posture unchanged, his face composed. But his eyes had darkened, the way still water darkens when something moves beneath the surface. Richard Albright fixed his gaze on Ethan, his voice flat and stripped of all warmth. "Explain." The single word landed like a gavel. Ethan was silent for several seconds, long enough for every person in the room to stop breathing. Then he spoke, his voice calm, almost soft, entirely without defensiveness. "I was working as a humanitarian interpreter in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A village within our operational zone experienced a cholera outbreak. The organization's standard protocol for emergency medical supply requisitions required a 6-week approval process, involving 3 levels of administrative review and 2 rounds of budget committee authorization. People were dying every single day. Women, children, elderly people who had survived wars and famines but could not survive bureaucracy. I used discretionary relief funds allocated to my field office to purchase antibiotics and oral rehydration supplies immediately, without submitting the required paperwork or waiting for approval. I knew I was violating protocol. I knew it would cost me my career." He paused. "I would do it again. Every time." Without hesitation, the conference room held its breath. Every eye in the room turned to Yamamoto. This was his negotiation, his decision, his judgment to render. Derek sat back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who believed the final blow had landed cleanly and the fight was over. The janitor was exposed. The charade was finished. Yamamoto sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured. In Japanese business culture, this posture does not signal indifference or disengagement. It signals the opposite. It is the posture of a man who is weighing a decision against the deepest values he holds, the way a jeweler holds a stone to the light and turns it slowly, looking for truth in the refraction. When Yamamoto opened his eyes, he spoke in Japanese. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the gravity of words that had been chosen with great care. Ethan translated, and for the first time all day, his voice held the faintest tremor. "Mr. Yamamoto says, in 30 years of building my company, I have met hundreds of people who speak beautifully, but very few who act rightly when the price of doing so is losing everything they have. That is the kind of person I want standing beside me. That is the kind of partner I have been searching for." Then Yamamoto turned to Derek. And for the first time in the entire meeting, the Japanese chairman spoke directly in English. His words were slow and precise, each one placed on the table like a stone laid in a path. "I also did my research. On everyone in this room, you should be more careful with what you choose to hide." The color drained from Derek's face so quickly it was almost visible, like watching a tide pull back from the shore. The conference room went cold and absolutely silent. Yamamoto turned back to the negotiation table. He sat down. He opened his document folder. He retrieved a pen. These small, deliberate actions constituted the clearest possible signal that he intended to stay. He stated a single condition. Ethan Mercer would serve as the official cultural and linguistic liaison for the entire duration of the partnership between Albright Global and the Yamamoto Group. Not only for today, for every major meeting, every significant negotiation, every critical exchange going forward, Richard Albright considered this for only a moment before nodding, and when he looked at Ethan, it was with entirely different eyes. Not the way one looks at a janitor who happened to be useful, not the way one looks at an interpreter who performed well under pressure, the way one looks at a man who has earned something that cannot be purchased or conferred, respect born from watching someone be exactly who they are when the cost of honesty is everything. Claire met Ethan's eyes from across the conference table. Her professional composure was intact, but barely, held together by the thinnest remaining thread. He looked back at her steadily. Neither of them said a word, but both of them understood, with the kind of certainty that does not require language in any dialect, that what had happened in this room today was larger than any contract, any partnership, any number with 9 zeros behind it. That evening, Ethan rode the subway back to Queens as the city shifted from the steel blue of twilight into the amber glow of streetlights. He walked the 4 blocks from the station to his building, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, and opened the door to his apartment. Lily came running from the living room immediately, launching herself at his legs with the fierce, full-body determination of a child who had been counting every minute since he left. He bent down, lifted her into his arms, and held her against his chest, tighter than usual, his face pressed into her hair, breathing in the smell of her shampoo and the faint antiseptic scent of her daily medication. His mother-in-law looked up from the small kitchen where she had been washing dishes. "How was your day?" He made Lily dinner, the same simple meal they shared most evenings, and afterward he sat on the edge of her bed and began telling her a bedtime story in French, the way he did every night. Lily listened for a few minutes, her eyes already heavy, then interrupted sleepily. "In Spanish, Daddy. Tell it in Spanish tonight." Ethan switched without missing a beat, his voice warm and unhurried, and in that tiny apartment in Queens, with the sound of traffic drifting through the thin walls, 8 languages served no billion-dollar purpose whatsoever. They served only the laughter of a 6-year-old girl who was fighting to stay awake long enough to hear how the story ended. Claire called at 9 o'clock. Her voice was different from the one he had heard all day in the conference room. Softer, less armored, more human. She told him that Richard Albright had made his decision. The company was creating an entirely new position, Director of Cross-Cultural Communications, designed specifically around Ethan's abilities. The salary would be 8 times what he currently earned as a janitor. The benefits package included comprehensive medical insurance, more than sufficient to cover the full cost of Lily's heart surgery, and the schedule would include the flexibility for him to continue picking up his daughter from school at 3 o'clock every single afternoon. Ethan said nothing for a long time. The silence on the phone stretched so thin it almost hummed. Claire asked quietly, "Are you okay?" His voice came back rough, barely above a whisper, cracked in a way that no amount of composure could hide. "I'm okay. I'm just trying not to cry because my daughter is watching me right now." Claire paused, and when she spoke again, her words came slowly, carefully, as if she were saying something she had only just discovered was true. "Ethan, you didn't just save a deal today. You reminded me why I started doing all of this in the first place, why I fought so hard to be in that room, and I had almost completely forgotten." The call ended. Ethan set his phone down on the kitchen counter and turned to look at Lily, who had fallen asleep on the sofa while waiting for him, her small arms still wrapped around a threadbare stuffed bear that had once belonged to her mother. Tears rolled silently down his face. They were not the tears of grief or sadness or exhaustion. They were something else entirely. They were the tears of a man who had spent 3 years doing nothing but surviving, and had just, for the first time, been given permission to hope. 6 months later, Ethan Mercer stood in the conference room on the 40th floor of Albright Global, the very same room he had once cleaned on his hands and knees, and led a multilingual negotiation session between the company and 3 international partners. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit. He spoke with quiet confidence and effortless precision. But every morning, without fail, when he walked through the lobby and past the service corridor, he stopped to greet every member of the cleaning crew by their first name. He never forgot who they were. He never forgot who he had been. Lily's surgery had been a complete success. His mother-in-law had sent him a video that he kept on his phone and watched every single night before falling asleep. In the video, Lily was running across a park with her arms spread wide, laughing so hard the camera shook, her legs carrying her farther and faster than they ever had in her life. For the first time, she did not have to stop. For the first time, she did not press her hand to her chest and wait for her breathing to slow. She just ran. Claire and Ethan built a professional relationship grounded in something rare in the corporate world. Mutual respect forged not in boardrooms but in shared vulnerability. They understood each other in the way that only 2 people can, who have both known what it feels like to be underestimated and overlooked. They ate lunch together every Wednesday at a small deli 3 blocks from the office. Lily called her Miss Claire without anyone ever suggesting she should, and Claire carried peppermint candies in her jacket pocket at all times because she had once noticed that Lily's eyes lit up at the taste. Derek Holton was subjected to an internal investigation after Yamamoto quietly provided the board with documented evidence that Derek had been leaking confidential corporate strategy materials to a competing firm for over a year. He was terminated, quietly, without spectacle, the way people who build careers on deception usually exit, not with confrontation but with a silence that nobody feels compelled to break. On weekends, Ethan taught free language classes at a community center in Queens, working with immigrant families and underprivileged children who reminded him of himself 30 years ago. He stood at the front of a donated classroom with a whiteboard and a box of markers and told his students the same thing every single session. Knowledge is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you. No matter how small your paycheck is, no matter how invisible you feel to the rest of the world. On a golden afternoon in late September, Ethan stood outside Lily's school, waiting. The front doors opened and children poured out in a noisy river of backpacks and untied shoelaces and unfinished conversations. Lily appeared in the middle of the crowd, running toward him, waving a piece of paper above her head like a flag. It was her Spanish quiz, the highest score in her entire class. Ethan laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deeper than amusement, and lifted her onto his shoulders. She sat up tall, her small hands resting on top of his head, and looked down at him with the absolute certainty that only a child possesses. "Daddy, teach me another language." Ethan looked up at the late afternoon sky above Queens, streaked with gold and fading blue, the kind of sky that makes even a tired city look like it is holding its breath for something beautiful. "Which one do you want to learn?" Lily thought about it for a long moment, her face scrunched with the gravity that only a 6-year-old can bring to the truly important questions in life. Then she smiled and said, "Whichever one you say I love you the best in." Ethan held her a little tighter on his shoulders, and standing there on a cracked sidewalk in Queens, with the noise of the city rising all around them like music they had learned to hear, he whispered "I love you" in 8 languages: English, Japanese, French, German, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese. One after another, each in a different voice, a different melody, a different corner of the world made small enough to fit inside a single breath, and each time, without exception, Lily laughed.